remember the sound as if it happened just yesterday, the click of high heels across polished wood floors, the faint laughter echoing through the hallway, and the voice I should have found familiar, but on that morning, it cut through me like a blade sharpened by years of quiet dismissal. "She just doesn't belong with us, Mom. Evelyn is too ordinary." A pause. Then came the blow dressed in silk. "It's not that I hate her, she just doesn't fit." I froze in the doorway, my old rolling suitcase betraying my presence with a soft clatter, and what shocked me more than her words was the fact that she didn't flinch. Clarissa's younger sister glanced at me through the hallway mirror, not a trace of panic in her perfectly contoured face. No guilt, no apology. Only that razor-thin smile she reserved for people beneath her notice. I forced out a smile of my own, the kind you wear when your dignity is hanging by a thread, and stepped into the house I was apparently never meant to feel welcome in. Clarissa, dressed in a pearl-colored silk dress, continued chatting with Mom as though I were an unfortunate smudge on her curated life. My mother averted her gaze. The air grew heavier than the coat I still hadn't taken off. That was Charleston, South Carolina gentle sun, blooming azaleas, and southern grace in every corner, but that morning, not even spring warmth could thaw the frost in my chest. I had only come because Mom had asked me to, worried I'd spend Easter alone while she and Dad fulfilled their lifelong dream, a cruise across the Mediterranean. "Clarissa's your sister," she had said gently, like it was the most natural bond in the world. "You should be together on a holiday." But I knew better than anyone sometimes. The ones who share your blood can cut the deepest. I wondered, if I'd arrived just 15 minutes later, would I have heard those words? If I had walked in during brunch, would Clarissa have smiled through her teeth and pretended I was a welcomed guest instead of a blemish on her Instagram-worthy life? And if I hadn't heard her say it, could I have clung to the belief, however thin, that there was still some sisterhood between us? I don't know. What I do know is this. Her words, "Evelyn is too ordinary," weren't just careless. They were a quiet verdict handed down by a jury I didn't even know was watching. And in that moment, standing in the entryway of her grand, glittering house, something inside me shifted. I would not leave. Not right away, not in shame. I would stay, not to argue, not to prove a point, but to let the silence reveal what pride never shouts. That sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply being exactly who they underestimated. Clarissa and I were born less than 2 years apart, yet somehow it always felt like we had come from different planets, orbiting the same family but never truly touching the same ground. While I sought quiet corners with library books and jigsaw puzzles, she chased light, sound, and attention like a moth drawn to every glittering flame. She was the one who danced center stage at every school recital, the girl whose birthday parties made it into the neighborhood newsletter, whose toothless childhood grin still sat framed in our parents' hallway, forever beaming from beneath a tiara won at the local Little Miss Carolina pageant. Even back then, it was clear who the world clapped for. Our parents, decent, loving people in most ways, never played favorites out loud, but there was something about the way their faces lit up when Clarissa entered a room that told me I'd never quite compete with that sparkle. She had a flair for spectacle, for turning everyday moments into a performance, and she mastered the art of being adored long before she even learned long division. While she preened for the camera in frilly dresses, I often sat just off frame, reading biographies of inventors and circling words I didn't know yet in the dictionary my grandfather gave me. It wasn't that I resented her shine, I just learned to live in the shade it cast. As the years passed, that contrast didn't soften, it sharpened. Clarissa went on to win regional pageants, landed a modeling contract at 16, and eventually studied communications in Los Angeles, where she reinvented herself into someone so glossy she practically gleamed. When she came back to South Carolina to launch her own PR consultancy, she was already fluent in the language of champagne brunches, influencer partnerships, and designer handbags that cost more than my first car. She was successful, in her own curated way, and the town adored her for it. Her life became a carousel of launches, galas, and being tagged in every high society feed that mattered. Meanwhile, I took a quieter road, no headlines, no parties. After graduating with a finance degree from Duke, I accepted a junior analyst role at a firm in Savannah. It wasn't glamorous, but I learned quickly, worked late, and saved religiously. While Clarissa posted selfies at rooftop cocktail bars, I was up at dawn reading market trends and earnings reports. I taught myself to study behavior not just of people, but of capital, and slowly, methodically, I began to build something substantial. No one clapped when I made my first 6 figures. No one knew when it quietly grew to 7, and certainly no one asked about my portfolio when I crossed into 8. But I didn't need the applause. Clarissa never asked me what I did for a living, not really. She once joked at a family dinner that I probably spent my days counting pennies for a local bank, and I let it slide, not because it was true, but because correcting her felt futile. To her, perception had always mattered more than fact. If I didn't advertise success, it must not exist. I suppose it was easier for her to believe that than to accept that her wallflower sister might have cultivated a different kind of power, one that didn't need validation or spotlight, one that grew in silence and compound interest. The emotional distance between us widened with every year. When Mom and Dad decided to spend Easter abroad, I didn't expect to hear from Clarissa at all. We lived in the same city for nearly 5 years and only crossed paths during holidays or family emergencies. So when Mom called, her voice tender with concern, urging me to spend Easter at Clarissa's home, part of me hesitated not out of defiance, but out of self-preservation. I knew what kind of reception awaited me. I knew Clarissa's parties were less about togetherness and more about image, and I was not the kind of accessory she'd choose to show off. Still, out of respect for Mom and Dad, I agreed. What I didn't anticipate was the hollow ache of hearing my sister draw a line so publicly, to hear her say I didn't belong in her world, one she had so thoroughly constructed out of glitter and status. It wasn't just the insult that stung. It was the certainty in her voice, that confident, casual cruelty wielded by someone who believed entirely in their own hierarchy. But what Clarissa didn't know, and what, at that point, no one did, was that while she polished her brand for the outside world, I had been quietly amassing a fortune by doing what I did best, watching, calculating, and investing in places no one else cared to look. My world didn't need filters or captions. It needed precision and patience. I didn't own stilettos, but I owned equity deep, diversified, and powerful in ways her curated life could never understand. It's strange how family can live in the same town, attend the same weddings, share the same childhood, and still become complete strangers. But I had long accepted that our paths had diverged beyond recognition. What I hadn't realized until that morning in her hallway was just how invisible I'd become in her version of the story. Not just overlooked, but erased. That's what hurt the most. Still, I didn't storm out. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even let the sting show on my face. Instead, I decided, in that exact moment, that I would play along not as the weak link she assumed I was, but as a quiet witness to the world she believed I could never understand. And maybe, if fate had a sense of irony, the truth would eventually resonate in confrontation, but in the quiet, undeniable force of reality breaking through the illusion. I remember sitting on the edge of that guest room bed, its mattress far too plush to feel like anything solid, the silence around me broken only by the faint ticking of an ornate wall clock that didn't belong to this decade, and certainly not to me. Clarissa's words, "She doesn't belong in my circle," looped through my mind with a rhythm so steady it might as well have been background music to my humiliation. I stared blankly at the gilded mirror across the room, taking in the reflection of a woman who didn't look particularly fragile, but whose chest ached with the kind of pain that doesn't bruise skin, only pride. For a moment, an honest, searing moment, I considered leaving. I thought about quietly wheeling my suitcase back down that marble hallway, calling a rideshare from the curb, and returning to the peaceful solitude of my apartment, where the air didn't feel judgmental and the walls didn't echo with exclusion. I imagined how easy it would be to disappear, to text Mom that I hadn't been feeling well and that maybe next Easter when they were home we could try again. But as I stood and approached the mirror, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't crying. My hands weren't shaking. In fact, beneath the sting of embarrassment, I felt something heavier taking root resolve. Why should I run? Why should I let someone else's limited view of who I am dictate how I carry myself? If Clarissa wanted to cast me in the tired old role of the unremarkable sister, then perhaps I'd let her keep believing that, if only to watch her stumble over the truth later. That thought didn't feel petty. It felt strangely grounding, like placing both feet firmly on the floor after drifting for too long. I took a long, deliberate breath and looked again at my reflection. My outfit was simple black blouse, jeans, hair pulled back in a no-fuss ponytail, but it was clean, comfortable, and authentically mine. There were no designer labels stitched into the fabric, no perfectly styled waves or manicured nails to bolster my standing in a crowd, yet I knew that nothing about my appearance spoke of lack. I didn't need decoration to feel valuable. I didn't need glitter to feel grounded. Just then, my phone buzzed gently on the nightstand. A market alert lit up the screen. An earnings report was about to be released, the kind I usually dove into with focus and anticipation, knowing how a single paragraph could shift the direction of a trade or unlock a new strategy for long-term growth. That world, the one Clarissa had never bothered to ask about, was my domain. While she flaunted her new clutch to a table of brunch guests, I was quietly diversifying a portfolio that had grown into something very few would ever suspect. She had always seen me as a mild-mannered office worker in flats and oatmeal sweaters, but she had no idea that the same woman she dismissed had built a fortune exceeding $300 million from scratch, without trust funds, connections, or applause. The truth was, I had spent the past decade learning how to spot undervalued assets companies, ideas, people, and nurture them quietly until they flourished. No one ever noticed until it was too late to dismiss the value. And maybe that was what gave me comfort now, not revenge in the explosive, vengeful sense, but the deep satisfaction that I had nothing to prove, and yet, if I ever chose to reveal the full story, no one could deny what I'd become. As the house settled into a hush, I wandered to the window and looked out over Clarissa's immaculately landscaped yard. It was perfect, too perfect. Each shrub shaped like a sculpture, the lawn trimmed like it was auditioning for a magazine spread. But it felt cold, sterile, like everything in her life existed for presentation, not purpose. And for the first time in years, I stopped envying her success and started questioning what she was actually building it on. Back in my room, I thought about the scholarship program I had quietly expanded over the winter. 6 new recipients from rural communities who now had a shot at higher education because of an anonymous benefactor. I thought about the water project I had funded in Bolivia, the mobile libraries in Mississippi, and the mental health fund I had seeded for retired veterans. No one had posted a photo of me at ribbon cuttings. No one even knew my name. But those lives were changing. And that was enough. I fell asleep that night with a strange sense of peace, not because anything had been resolved, but because I had chosen not to crumble beneath someone else's gaze. I wasn't leaving. I wouldn't let my sister's careless words drive me away. I would stay not as a guest needing validation, but as a woman who had earned the right to stand in any room without explaining herself. Whatever tomorrow's brunch would bring, I was ready. Easter morning arrived cloaked in sunlight, filtering through the tall windows of Clarissa's grand southern home as if even nature had been summoned to perform. The scent of fresh peonies wafted through the air, mingling with citrus zest and the faint trace of luxury candle wax that seemed to live permanently in the corners of her carefully staged world. From the top of the stairs, I could hear the low hum of activity caterers bustling in the kitchen, trays clinking against marble counters, and the subtle melody of a harp being tuned by a young woman with a face as composed as a porcelain doll. I descended quietly, instinctively trying not to draw attention, though I already knew that in this house, my presence was never neutral. It was either unwanted or ignored. The foyer sparkled with polished brass and spotless glass, each surface a mirror for someone else's vanity. Clarissa stood in the kitchen in a pastel sheath dress that matched the floral arrangements on the long dining table, her hair cascading in soft curls and her voice lilting as she gave instructions, not to the staff, but to the performance unfolding under her direction. When she saw me, her smile was mechanical, more of a reflex than a welcome, and with a distracted wave she said, "Just mingle, Evelyn. I'm sure you'll find someone to talk to." Her tone didn't invite conversation, it politely dismissed the possibility of it. Still, I offered to help out of habit. Not hope but was quickly waved off like an unnecessary interruption to her curated atmosphere. Guests began arriving in waves, each more polished than the last. There was Caroline in a linen jumpsuit tailored to perfection, Lucas in a blazer that probably cost more than my entire travel wardrobe, and Jasmine, who breezed in wearing a dress so sheer it seemed designed more for the camera than the occasion. Their conversations floated effortlessly from hedge funds and gallery openings to which exclusive rooftop bar had the best oysters this spring. Names dropped like pearls scattering across tile, always gleaming, always meant to be noticed. I kept to the edges, hovering near the French doors that opened to a terrace bathed in golden light, where a string quartet had taken over from the harpist and now played a medley of classical pieces with such grace it almost softened the edges of the room. Almost. I watched as Clarissa played hostess with military precision, offering compliments, arranging napkins with subtle flicks of the wrist, and ensuring that every detail served the image she worked tirelessly to project. To anyone else, it was elegant. To me, it was a dress rehearsal for a life she hadn't yet realized was exhausting her. At some point, a woman I vaguely recognized from Clarissa's social media appeared beside me. She introduced herself as Evelyn Chambers, though I already knew her face from countless tagged brunch photos. Her smile was pleasant, practiced, and just a shade too curious. "And you are?" she asked, holding a flute of champagne with fingers adorned in stacked diamond rings. "I'm Evelyn, Clarissa's sister," I replied, extending my hand and bracing for the pause that always followed. "Ah," she said, her brows lifting. "Finance, right?" It was the tone people used when they weren't sure if they were speaking to someone important or merely someone adjacent to importance. "Yes," I replied simply, but before I could elaborate, Clarissa glided over like a swan cutting through still water. She slipped an arm around Evelyn's shoulder and added, with a light laugh that did little to hide its condescension, "She just dabbles, keeps things low-key." The group around us chuckled politely, not cruelly, but casually, the way people laugh when they think there's no risk in doing so. I felt my cheeks flush not from shame, but from the quiet fury that only grows in the shadows of disrespect. Still, I didn't correct her. I didn't need to. Let them believe what they wanted. I had learned long ago that real power doesn't announce itself. It listens, it observes, and when the moment is right, it simply is. The brunch itself was an opulent affair, like something lifted from the pages of a lifestyle magazine. Plates were adorned with wildflower garnishes and microgreens. Tiny quiches sat beside color-coordinated macaroons, and every champagne glass sparkled like it had been polished individually by hand. A small orchestra played outside, their music flowing through the open terrace as Clarissa's guests shared laughter and half-baked financial advice, their voices rising and falling with theatrical timing. I sat near the end of the table, bracketed by two men who spent more time discussing private jets and portfolio, rebalancing, than noticing the food they were pushing around on their plates. No one asked where I spent my holidays, how I felt about our parents being away, or whether I even liked being there. It was as though I existed in peripheral vision, visible but unacknowledged. Across the table, Clarissa kept stealing glances, ensuring I remained in my placescent, compliant, non-threatening. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't simply being polite. I was studying. I was measuring the room not in social capital, but in emotional fragility. Every laugh, every humble brag, every performative gesture told me more about them than they would ever know about me. They were terrified not of failure, but of being ordinary. I sipped my drink and looked around the table, taking in the gleam of cutlery, the abundance of pastel blooms, and the subtle undercurrent of competition dressed up as conversation. It was stunning, yes, but also exhausting. This wasn't community, it was theater, and everyone was desperate to be cast in the starring role. And yet, I felt no need to intervene or rise above it. I was content letting them underestimate me because, in doing so, they revealed everything I needed to know about them and nothing about me. My story, my worth, my truth wasn't up for their evaluation, and in that knowledge I found a strength far greater than applause. So I sat, quiet and steady, knowing that someday, maybe not today, maybe not even soon, but eventually, the weight of their assumptions would crumble under the truth they never saw coming. The days after the brunch passed in quiet, rhythmic motion, emails answered, market reports reviewed, strategy calls held with a calm authority that no one in Clarissa's circle would have imagined belonged to the woman in the simple blouse who drank her champagne in silence. I went back to my routines like I always did, grounded by the very things that made me invisible to them: discipline, discretion, and a deep sense of purpose. Clarissa, unsurprisingly, didn't reach out beyond a perfunctory thank you text that read more like obligation than reconciliation, and I didn't push for more. The truth is, I didn't need her approval. I never had. But I did carry with me the echo of her words: she doesn't belong in my circle, not as a wound, but as a reminder of the fragile scaffolding that holds up so many social facades. Then, one quiet Monday evening, as I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the preliminary report of a new grant program I had just funded in West Virginia, one that would bring vocational training to single mothers in under-resourced counties, my phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. "Is this Evelyn M. from the article?" it said, followed by a link. For a moment, my heart paused, not in fear, but in cautious curiosity. I clicked. The headline that appeared was equal parts surreal and vindicating: "The Silent Strategist. Meet Evelyn M., the private investor behind $300 million in smart capital." My breath caught, not because the information was inaccurate, but because I had spent over a decade intentionally keeping my name out of the spotlight, letting the numbers and the impact speak for themselves. But someone likely, a journalist embedded in the nonprofit finance world, had connected the dots between the anonymous donor at a recent charity gala and the quiet force behind several game-changing philanthropic funds. The article didn't just scratch the surface. It traced my journey from modest beginnings to mastery of markets, from a junior analyst with a broken-down laptop to a woman who quietly acquired stakes in undervalued tech companies, renewable energy startups, and emerging market disruptors long before they became headlines. It highlighted the scholarships I'd launched, the libraries I had funded, the clean water projects I'd sponsored not as vanity projects, but as acts of conviction rooted in a belief that wealth should move the needle for someone other than the person holding it. At the bottom of the article was a photo one I hadn't even realized had been taken of me at a literacy event in Asheville, accepting a small plaque from a local foundation. My name was printed clearly, and though I wore no makeup and had my hair in a simple bun, there was a confidence in my posture that no amount of high fashion could replicate. I closed my laptop slowly, fully aware of what this meant. My carefully held privacy had slipped, and there would be ripples. And the first ripple came faster than expected. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Marla, an old acquaintance of Clarissa's who worked tangentially in wealth advisory. "Evelyn," she said breathlessly, "I just read the article. Is that really you?" Her tone hovered somewhere between awe and confusion, and I could already sense the shift beginning the pivot people make, when they realize the quiet one in the room has been holding the cards all along. By that evening, the article had begun to circulate in niche circles, private equity groups, non-profit boards, and yes, the very social stratosphere where Clarissa floated so effortlessly. I didn't need confirmation to know that the gossip had reached her. But it came anyway. Clarissa's friend Dahlia, the one who had spent most of brunch talking about her Pilates studio's rebranding, apparently brought it up during a rooftop dinner, waving her phone and exclaiming, "Wait, this is your sister?" Clarissa, caught off guard and without a rehearsed narrative, stammered through a vague response, claiming she sort of knew I was doing something in finance but hadn't realized the scale. But the photo was undeniable, and worse for her was the fact that she had never once mentioned me as anything but plain, quiet Evelyn. By the next morning, Clarissa called. The screen lit up while I was in a video conference about a clean energy initiative I was co-funding. I let it ring. When I called her back, her voice was clipped, brittle, and charged with the kind of panic people feel when their story has been rewritten without their permission. "You never told me," she said, skipping pleasantries altogether. "You never said anything." Do you have any idea how humiliating it was when Dahlia showed me that article at dinner like it was some kind of joke? I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Clarissa, I never hid anything. I just didn't advertise it. There's a difference." Her breath hitched audibly. "But you let everyone think you were just some low-level finance clerk. You didn't correct me when I called you low-key. You sat there while everyone looked down on you." "That was your narrative, not mine," I said calmly. "You assumed, I let you." There was a long silence, thick with unspoken frustration, and something softer beneath it, maybe shame, maybe sorrow. And though part of me wanted to hang up, to protect the peace I had so carefully built, I stayed on the line. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't just about pride, it was about identity, about family. About seeing someone you thought you knew become someone you never bothered to understand. "Why didn't you just tell me?" she finally asked, quieter now. "Why live like that? Why keep it all a secret?" "Because I don't need recognition to feel valuable," I said. "Because I measure success by what it allows me to give, not how many people applaud when I walk into a room." She didn't respond right away, and I didn't press. Some truths land like thunder. Others take time to sink in. But as I ended the call, I felt a stillness settle in me, a sense that the story I had been quietly writing for years had finally stepped into the light, not with vengeance, but with undeniable presence. And as strange as it sounds, I wasn't angry with Clarissa. I wasn't even particularly vindicated. I was just free.